The last letter ever written in Linear B was a plea for help, never read by the one it begged to save. What happens when the very foundations of civilization crumble in an instant? Around 1200 BCE, civilization didn't decline. It shattered, not over centuries, but in mere decades. Great palaces reduced to ash, ancient cities emptied, writing systems forgotten like dreams upon waking. Trade networks that had connected 3 continents simply vanished. For the people living through it, this wasn't just political upheaval, it was apocalypse. The Mycenaeans never rebuilt. The mighty Hittite Empire, erased from history. Ugarit, the cosmopolitan trading hub, burned in a single night, its cuneiform tablets frozen mid-message. Ships of the enemy have come. They have set our cities on fire. The enemy does what he pleases in the countryside. Egypt, the eternal kingdom, teetered on the edge of dissolution. And in the void left behind, something darker than destruction spread. But what if that silence wasn't death, but metamorphosis? What if the Bronze Age collapse wasn't civilization's end, but its brutal reboot? Here's the truth our textbooks rarely teach. The collapse wasn't universal. While empires crumbled, certain communities didn't just survive. They adapted, innovated, and rewrote the rules of civilization itself. Iron technology, forged in the ashes of bronze-dependent economies. New writing systems, evolving where older scripts failed. Power decentralized, shifting from palace to village. New gods rising, answering different human needs. From these survivors, the DNA of our modern world was conceived. But why did some endure while others vanished without trace? And what really triggered this system's collapse that reset human history? Was it natural catastrophe? Earthquakes and drought conspiring against human ambition? Economic implosion when bronze-based economies faced resource scarcity? Or was there sabotage, a deliberate dismantling by marginalized peoples who had nothing to lose? In this investigation, we'll uncover what conventional histories often neglect: the resilient strategies of tiny coastal communities that outlasted mighty empires, the crucial role of women in preserving cultural memory when institutional knowledge collapsed, and the story of forgotten peoples who, operating in the margins of fallen kingdoms, quietly laid the foundations for Greek city-states and eventually democracy itself. Beneath the ash and ruin lies a code, buried in clay, stone, and silence, that reveals how humans don't merely survive collapse, they transform through it. Let's journey back, not to mourn the Bronze Age's spectacular fall, but to witness perhaps the most important moment in human history, the birth of resilience itself, when ordinary people, not kings or gods, discovered they could rebuild a world better than the one that burned. This isn't just their story. In an age facing its own systemic challenges, it may be our future as well. When the gods went silent in 1177 BCE, a child in Ugarit wrote to the gods. And for the first time in history, they didn't write back. Bronze gleams under the Mediterranean sun. Slaves strain under copper ingots from Cyprus, their shadows falling across temple murals of Baal, the storm god who brings the rains. In the royal palace, a scribe's reed stylus presses methodically into soft clay, drafting a diplomatic message to Egypt. Nearby, a priest selects a knife for tomorrow's bull sacrifice, testing its edge with practiced precision. Then, without warning, the harbor empties. Trade vessels vanish from the horizon. Merchants fail to return from their journeys. By nightfall, the watchtowers report distant flames. Within weeks, the scribes who recorded 3 centuries of civilization lie dead, their stylus is buried in ash. A single tablet survives, abandoned mid-sentence. The enemy is approaching. They are burning the cities. No reply was ever sent, because Ugarit no longer existed. This wasn't the collapse of a single city. It was the unraveling of an entire world order. From Greece to Mesopotamia, palaces didn't merely fall, they were systematically destroyed. Networks of trade that had connected three continents disintegrated. Literacy, that most fragile thread of human knowledge, vanished in regions where it had flourished for centuries. Entire scripts, Linear B, Hittite hieroglyphs, Ugaritic cuneiform, went extinct in less than a century. Languages died with no one left to speak them. These weren't just civilizations, they were systems. 1. Multi-state diplomacy conducted through royal marriages and gift exchanges. Second, interregional food redistribution networks that fed millions. Third, religious coordination that synchronized rituals across borders. They believed their gods had created eternal order. But the gods, it seems, had gone silent. For generations, historians blamed the mysterious sea peoples, faceless invaders from the north. But no one asked the deeper question: why did the sea peoples exist at all? New evidence tells a more complex story. 1. A mega drought lasting decades, revealed in pollen cores and lake sediments. Second, volcanic eruptions that darken skies from Iceland to Anatolia, dropping global temperatures. Third, solar minima, reducing crop yields across the northern hemisphere. Fourth, fungal blights that decimated stored grain, turning survival supplies to poison. What happens when harvests fail for a generation? When children grow up knowing only hunger? Entire villages abandoned their fields and became war bands. Palace guards, unpaid, turned mercenary. Starving farmers became raiders out of desperation. Famine breeds fire. Fire breeds migration. Migration becomes invasion. The sea peoples weren't alien invaders. They were us after the system failed. In a tomb in Thebes, archaeologists found dozens of hastily buried bodies, children and elderly, decomposing in corners, covered with minimal ceremony. Their deaths weren't glorious battlefield tales for epic poems. They died from dehydration, infection, neglect. In Troy 7, the city Homer mythologized as falling heroically to Greek warriors. Evidence tells a different story. Not a grand war, but starvation. The storerooms were empty. The bodies weren't warriors. They were women and children, the elderly, those who couldn't flee. This wasn't a story of noble decline. It was a collapse of dignity. When systems fail, they don't just take our buildings and our wealth, they take our humanity. But if everything collapsed, why did anything survive at all? The mystery unfolds. Before the Bronze Age collapsed, kings were being assassinated in temples, empires falsified their own census records, and entire cities were starving in silence, because admitting the truth was more dangerous than collapse itself. The system didn't collapse because it was weak. It collapsed because everyone pretended it wasn't. In the final years of Ugarit, palace scribes meticulously recorded phantom grain shipments, vessels that existed only in clay, not on water. Elaborate records documented arrivals of wealth that never materialized. Not mistakes, deliberate fabrications. A desperate letter from Ugarit's last king pleads to his neighbor across the sea. "My father, the enemy approaches our gates. My ships are gone. There is no grain. My people cry out with hunger. Will you send help before we are lost?" That letter was never read, never delivered. It was found still sealed, buried under the ash of the palace it was written in. A message of truth that came too late. Collapse didn't begin with war or natural disaster. It began with bureaucracy. with the systematic denial of reality by those whose job was to record it. While empire monuments proclaimed eternal prosperity, archaeologists uncover a different story buried beneath. Inland fortresses in the Levant began stockpiling grain and weapons 2 decades before any recorded invasions. Someone knew trouble was coming. Hattusa's final years reveal metallurgy workshops suddenly abandoned, bronze production halted before any mention of sea peoples in historical records. Mycenaean palaces quietly reinforced defensive walls while publicly declaring peace and prosperity. What if these great powers weren't destroyed by invaders? What if they crumbled from within, then were merely finished off by outsiders? The sea peoples may not have caused the collapse. They harvested it. Collapse wasn't just physical, it was ideological, a failure to adapt when reality contradicted the established order. Mycenaean kings hosted lavish religious festivals, even as villages emptied. Peasants fled failing farms, and food stores dwindled. Egyptian elite scribes maintained unchanged temple ration records year after year, despite visible evidence of catastrophic crop failures. By the time collapse was inevitable, it was illegal to admit it. Officials who reported failures were removed. Messengers bearing bad news disappeared. Imagine a civilization where lying was not only rewarded, it was required to survive in the elite circles of power. Truth became treason, reality became heresy, denial became duty. The Sea Peoples weren't simply bloodthirsty invaders. They were the displaced victims of collapsed economies, failed states, and environmental catastrophe. What if the enemy at the gates were once your allies at port? What turned trading partners into desperate invaders? DNA analysis from a Philistine cemetery in Ashkelon, 2019, reveals remarkably mixed ancestry. Not conquering warriors, but displaced families from across the Mediterranean. Some Sea Peoples' settlements contain family religious idols, weaving tools, and agricultural implements. These weren't the possessions of conquerors, but of exiles seeking new homes. So who turned them into warriors? There was no villain. There was no sudden war. There was no single catastrophe. There was only a system so perfect, so efficient, so interdependent, that when the first thread snapped, no one knew how to stop the unraveling. The true tragedy: those who recognized the crisis couldn't speak. Those with power to act wouldn't listen. Those who should have recorded the truth were ordered to write lies. And by the time reality could no longer be denied, there were no libraries left to write it down. There is no record of the last breath of Mycenae, no witness account, no chronicle of its end, only silence and ash. The most advanced civilizations of their age vanished not with a scream, but with a whisper. No final defense, no farewell inscription, just abandoned halls, still set for banquets that would never come. When archaeologists opened the ruins of Ugarit, they found cooking pots with food still inside, plates abandoned mid-meal, bread ovens still loaded with loaves turned to carbon. These people didn't evacuate. They didn't pack their treasures. They fled mid-meal, or died where they stood, between one heartbeat and the next. What made an entire civilization disappear between dinner and dawn? In Ugarit's palace archive, over 1,500 clay tablets lie vitrified by fire. They survived, not because they were preserved, but because they were accidentally baked in the inferno that consumed their world. Letters were found unopened, treaties unsigned, diplomatic correspondence unanswered. The machinery of empire frozen in a single, catastrophic moment. The final tablet recovered reads, "The enemy approaches the city walls. Our ships are gone. My lord, what are we to do?" That's it. The next tablet is blank. No answer was ever recorded. Was there time to react, to organize, to defend? The evidence suggests no. These empires weren't defeated in prolonged conflict. They were ambushed by inevitability. But who or what lit the match? We know the names of Bronze Age kings, Suppiluliuma, Tukulti Ninurta, Amenhotep. We read their boasts of eternal power, but what of their final days? No royal tomb records their death. No ritual marks their fall. In Mycenae, not a single royal burial has been found dating to the final destruction layer. The rulers who built monuments to their own immortality vanished without trace. Hattusa's royal palace was deliberately stripped of royal insignia before its fall. Royal statues defaced, cartouches chiseled away, names erased. These weren't sudden defeats by outside forces. These were ritual erasures, as if someone wanted these rulers forgotten, their memory extinguished. Was this collapse assisted from within? When cities burned, their gods vanished with them. The rituals stopped. No incense, no sacrifice, no prayer. 3,000 years of unbroken worship, suddenly, permanently silenced. In Imar, the final clay tablet was a religious calendar, paused mid-year. The spring festivals recorded in detail. The autumn rituals, blank space, as if tomorrow would never come. In Ugarit, the storm god Baal's statue was found shattered beneath his own altar, not just destroyed, ritually murdered. When gods fall silent, civilizations die not just from war or famine, but from the collapse of meaning itself. What is a palace without divine sanction? What is a king without celestial blessing? What does a people do when even the gods stop answering? 1,000 years of knowledge collapsed in less than a generation. No monuments were raised to mourn what was lost. No poets sang elegies for fallen kingdoms. Just scattered fragments, waiting 3,000 years for us to listen. 90% of linear B inscriptions vanished after the collapse. The script itself forgotten, unread for 3 millennia. Literacy itself retracted for centuries. What took a millennium to build, the ability to speak across time, was lost in a single lifetime. The collapse didn't just erase cities, it didn't just end dynasties, it erased the very idea of remembering. But from this void, something new would rise, different, unexpected. The age of empires had ended in fire and silence. What emerged from the ashes, no one could have predicted, not even the gods themselves. History is more than what happened. It's what we choose to remember. If you're still with us, it means you're one of the few who refuses to let the past fade into silence. So take a moment, like this video, leave your thoughts below, and subscribe for stories that dig deeper than the surface. And if you don't want to miss what comes next, turn on the notification bell. The truth is layered, and we're only just beginning to uncover it. This isn't a story about ruins. This is a story about people who buried their own children, then buried their gods. A scribe in Ugarit wrote by torchlight as the world he knew crumbled around him. His stylus pressed urgent symbols into wet clay. Enemy ships are already entering the harbor. Our granaries are empty. The city walls cannot. He never finished. We found his tablet still in the kiln. It had already been fired. Too late to deliver. Too late to save anyone. His city burned, and his words burned with it, becoming immortal only through catastrophe. But what if he wasn't the only one writing in the dark? What if the last moments of a dying age left traces we're only beginning to understand? When civilizations collapse, it's not just buildings that fall, it's belief systems, trust, the sacred boundaries between life and death. In Tyrans, archaeologists discovered child skeletons buried beneath thresholds, once thought to be foundation sacrifices. now recognized as desperate attempts at spiritual protection as the Mycenaean world unraveled. In Imar, Syria, cattle bones and human remains were interred together in patterns never seen before, improvised rituals with no precedent in their cultural tradition. In Cyprus at Kition, burned remains show signs of possible ritual human sacrifice resurgence. Practices abandoned centuries earlier, suddenly revived in the final desperate years. They didn't just lose their cities, they lost their sense of the sacred. When temples collapsed, they built altars in kitchens. When priests vanished, mothers became the keepers of ritual. When gods went silent, they whispered to bones. In Cyprus, we see them revive blood rituals long thought extinct. The fire consuming their world wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, a fundamental rupture in how humans related to the divine. What kind of apocalypse forces a people to kill again in the name of protection? What happens when the contract between gods and mortals is irreparably broken? Signs of brief rebuilding appear in Mycenae, Pylos, and Troy, settlements reconstructed on still warm ashes, only to be destroyed again within a generation. Storage rooms restocked, walls rebuilt, foundations strengthened, only for fire and sword to return, not once but twice, sometimes 3 times. In Troy, they cleared the rubble, rebuilt the walls, planted fresh olive trees that would take decades to bear fruit, a statement of faith in a future they would never see. Then the sea peoples came again, or drought, or someone else entirely. They didn't just fall once. They fell, stood up, and fell harder. A cycle of hope and annihilation that archaeology has only recently revealed. Why does history bury these failed rebirths? Who benefits from forgetting that survival isn't always triumph? That sometimes it's just prolonged tragedy. The names of kings survived in stone and epic. The names of mothers survived in no one's memory. But in the ashes of a burnt house in Pylos, archaeologists found the body of a woman, her arms wrapped around 2 children until the very end. There was no gold, no offering, no monument. Just 3 collapsed rib cages pressed into ash. No inscription to tell us who she was or what she prayed for in her final moments. For every royal palace in our history books, 1,000 unnamed families huddled in darkness. For every king's chronicle, 1,000,000 stories never told. For every temple hymn recorded, countless final prayers whispered into smoke. What if the myths we've clung to for thousands of years aren't just stories? What if they're echoes of a catastrophe so vast it shattered entire civilizations, leaving nothing behind but memories disguised as legends? Everyone blames the sea peoples. They were the invaders. But what if the true cause of the collapse was not external? What if it was a self-inflicted wound? Civilization wasn't brought down by foreign armies alone. It was undermined from within, a brutal cocktail of political collapse, internal revolt, and systemic failure. What if the collapse was not a disaster of nature, but of men who pushed their empires too far? The truth? It's hidden beneath the rubble, buried in the places no one dares to look, because it's too shocking to confront, but we will. It's easy to glorify kings, to immortalize warriors in stone. But what of the farmers, the artisans, the children, those who lived without crowns but paid the price of a collapsing world? The survivors didn't just mourn their lost kingdoms. They mourned their lost selves. Homer's Odyssey was not just a king's return from war. It was a metaphor for a broken man who couldn't go home again. Could this be the legacy of every person who survived? But there's more to the story. What if the fall didn't just break the past? It shaped the very essence of who we are today. In the ruins of Mycenae, The story of one king stands out, one who wasn't just defeated by invaders, but was swallowed by the very forces he helped unleash. The collapse didn't just end empires, it ended the idea of kingship itself. We've been told that kings were heroes, but the real story is darker. The kings who ruled in the aftermath weren't victors. They were survivors living on the brink of oblivion, haunted by the failure of their ancestors. But this king's legacy is a warning, and one we still haven't learned to heed. What if the collapse wasn't just an event? What if it was a message encoded in the very fabric of myth? Legends like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey weren't just stories, they were survival guides, codes, warnings, and memories of a world that had failed. The survivors weren't trying to forget the collapse. They were trying to teach their descendants how to avoid it. The Dark Ages were not dark because of their lack of light, but because of what they chose to bury. What exactly was hidden in the myths of Homer? And why did the gods seem so eerily absent when they were needed most? We call them myths, but what if they're the only thing left to remind us of what we lost? What if the collapse didn't kill the past, but buried it so deep we've never fully understood its cost? The fall didn't mark the end. It marked the beginning of a new kind of world. But how would the survivors rebuild after everything was shattered? Join us next time as we uncover the lost civilizations that rose from the ashes of the Bronze Age collapse. The survivors of the collapse didn't build monuments. They buried children. And what came next wasn't civilization. It was a gamble, a fragile, desperate gamble to forget the past and make damn sure it never returned. Greece, circa 1050 BCE. The silence after the storm. Forget everything you know about the Greek miracle. This is where it really starts. Not in marble temples, but in collapsed drainage systems and burnt baby bones and tyrants. We're in a post-Mycenaean wasteland. The elites are gone. No writing, no trade. But archaeologists find graves that are better furnished than the living homes around them. Why? Because memory was more important than life. They weren't rebuilding, they were pretending the past was still alive. Excavations at Nicoria show homes being built directly into the ruins of palaces, like rats nesting in a dead lion's ribcage. But while the mainland mourned, a new force was quietly waking on the coast. The Levant, circa 1000 BCE. Phoenicia rises. Empires burned. The Phoenicians didn't flinch. They didn't weep for gods or kings. They got on their ships and sold the ruins back to the survivors. The Phoenicians weren't just traders. They thrived because collapse cleared their competitors. They took broken bronze from wreckage and remelted it for tools and trinkets, then sold it back to inland refugees. The Phoenicians invented the alphabet not for art, but to streamline cargo inventory. Literacy wasn't sacred, it was scalable. A shipping manifest scratched onto clay next to a child's grave. But the sea was safe. Inland, the dead began to whisper. Central Anatolia, Canaan, a post-collapse world. In the ruins, something harder than bronze was born, not just iron, but cruelty scaled down. The Philistines, long demonized, weren't destroyers. They were farmers with foreign gods trying to belong. Their kitchens blend Greek and Levantine tools. They bury children under thresholds for protection. Fear drives custom. Meanwhile, iron smelting appears not from genius, but from mistake. Low-tech attempts to smelt bronze failing upwards. Entire villages adapt, even as kings vanish. Iron wasn't better, it was available. Less efficient, more brittle, but you didn't need empire-scale trade to get it. Collapse made it practical. And as they forged new weapons, old memories hardened into stories. Dead kings would return, but only in dreams. 1,000 fireside retellings, the birth of oral epics. What if everything you thought you knew about the rise of civilizations is a lie? What if the golden age of Greece, Israel, and Egypt wasn't the start of something new, but the brutal rebirth of something lost to fire and fear? It wasn't Homer's Iliad that gave birth to Greece. It was the collapse of a civilization so violent, so savage, that it left no written record for centuries. What we call the Dark Ages wasn't just a gap in history, it was a conscious erasure of a traumatic past. The so-called Dark Ages were not a quiet retreat into barbarism. The Mycenaeans, the Greeks who preceded Homer, were obliterated by war and natural disaster. And yet, it wasn't war that marked their end. It was memory. And from the ruins, the Greeks rebuilt a culture on a foundation of oral memory, so potent it could withstand centuries. But here's the shock. What if I told you the gods of Olympus were not gods at all? They were twisted memories of the kings who had died violently, their stories retold until they became legends. The Bible wasn't written by holy men. It was crafted by survivors. Israelites weren't just inventing a religion. They were weaving the very fabric of their collective trauma into every word. The story of Exodus, the birth of a nation, was born from a violent displacement, not divine inspiration. The earliest traces of Israelite culture didn't come from Jerusalem. They came from a scattered group of tribes who were adapting Canaanite gods into something new. They weren't just rejecting foreign invaders. They were rewriting their own violent past. But the Israelites weren't the only ones rewriting history. Egypt had its own shadows to face, and they would never let the world forget it. Egypt's greatest secret wasn't its pyramids. It was the refusal to die. The new kingdom collapsed, but Egypt didn't vanish. It became a shadow empire, ruled not by pharaohs but by priests, quietly rewriting the past and consolidating power without firing a single arrow. When Susenes I was buried in Tanis, he wasn't just king. He was the embodiment of Egypt's most dangerous secret, power without the appearance of power. For centuries, Egypt's soul was preserved by those who understood that true strength came from memory, not might. But Egypt wasn't alone in this. There were others, nations that disappeared into the sands, but whose legacies lived on in the shadows of the empires that followed. The Bronze Age didn't fall. It transformed into something darker, more dangerous, and more lasting. The survivors didn't just rebuild. They rewrote the rules of civilization itself, with memory as their weapon and myth as their shield. Even the gods were rebuilt from the ruins, resurrected from the fire and decay into new forms of authority. Mycenaean gods morphed into the Greek pantheon. Israel's vengeful deities shaped an entire religion. Egypt's former pharaohs were reforged into god-kings of a nation that could never truly die. And as these civilizations stood back on their feet, they faced the world with a question. What would become of a civilization that had already been lost once? The world didn't just fall apart, it tore itself apart. Kingdoms collapsed, but from the wreckage, a terrifying question emerged. Who would rise from the ashes? Not the powerful, not the rich, but those who had nothing left to lose. When the great Bronze Age civilizations collapsed, they left behind more than ruins. They left a vacuum of power. In this chaos, the hoplite warrior was born. But here's the twist. These weren't just professional soldiers. They were ordinary citizens forced to take up arms, turning their cities into fortresses of survival. The hoplite shield was not just for defense. It was a symbol of a society fighting to hold on to its identity in a world that had forgotten what it meant to be civilized. The Greek hoplite system wasn't just an innovation in military tactics. It was a direct response to the collapse of the social fabric. As the old elites lost power, ordinary citizens became the ultimate power brokers. And this shift in military structure would forever reshape the balance of power in the ancient world. In fact, it's the reason democracy began to take root in Greece. Citizens who fought together stood together. But the hoplites weren't the only ones to take up arms. Across the Mediterranean, a new wave of invaders had begun their conquest, a mysterious force with no name, no face, but a terrifying reputation. Who were they? The collapse didn't just displace the wealthy, it unleashed a frenzy of migration as thousands of refugees flooded the Mediterranean. But the most mysterious of all were the sea peoples. Scholars have speculated about their identity for centuries. But here's what we know. They were not just invaders, they were survivors, displaced by the same collapse that decimated the Mycenaeans and Egyptians. But they didn't just arrive. They transformed the very civilizations they encountered. The Philistines, who arrived on the coast of Canaan, weren't simply barbarians. They were the architects of a new political system forged in the fires of chaos. They brought with them not only new military tactics, but cultural innovations that would change the Levant forever. In fact, the Philistines may have been descendants of the very sea peoples, a phenomenon that reveals a deeply unsettling truth. The collapse of one world created the conditions for a new form of imperialism. But the sea peoples didn't just reshape the Levant. Far to the east, another power was quietly emerging, one that would eventually eclipse all others in its quest for survival and conquest. As the Mediterranean burned and new powers emerged, the collapse of the Bronze Age set the stage for one of the most profound technological shifts in history: the discovery of iron. Iron was cheaper, more accessible, and most critically, it was deadlier. But here's the shocking twist. The collapse wasn't the cause of the rise of iron. It was its symptom. Iron spread quickly in a desperate race to survive. Those who controlled iron could control the future of warfare and the future of their world. The Greeks, who had been living in the shadow of the Mycenaeans, quickly adapted to this new material. But what they didn't realize was that iron had a dark power. It not only transformed warfare, but it gave rise to new political systems. As city-states like Athens armed themselves with iron, they also armed themselves with an ideology, one that would later lead to the birth of democracy. Iron changed everything, but the truth is darker, because iron didn't just create warriors, it created tyrants. And with tyrants came the inevitable collapse of the old world order. But who could stand against them? Who would survive? But as the new world took shape, something far more ominous loomed on the horizon. An ancient enemy, long forgotten but never fully eradicated, was about to return. And they would bring with them a weapon unlike anything the Mediterranean had ever seen. What happens when the gods fall silent? When the heavens that once guided kingdoms crumble to dust? In the wreckage of a dying world, humanity's greatest leap was not forward, but inward, a leap into the void left by the collapse of civilization. The gods had failed, and now man must question his place in a broken world. The collapse of the Bronze Age was not just a fall, it was a crushing defeat. Powerful empires, proud cities, and divine rulers were swept away, leaving only ruins. In the ruins, survivors didn't just rebuild, they redefined themselves. What they rebuilt was a world with no certainty, no gods to guide them. The collapse shattered more than just cities. It fractured the soul of the ancient world. The gods, once the pillars of power, were now seen as silent witnesses to humanity's greatest suffering. This silence didn't just inspire despair. It demanded answers. What had once been unquestionable, the divine will, was now the very thing that needed to be challenged. The disillusionment with the divine wasn't just philosophical, it was practical. In places like Greece, where the gods had once been invoked to justify war, peace, and prosperity, the absence of divine intervention forced people to turn to new methods of understanding: logic, reasoning, and philosophy. But this crisis of faith didn't stop in Greece. Across the ancient world, other voices began to rise, questioning the old ways. What they found was more unsettling than anyone could have predicted. Philosophy was not born out of intellectual curiosity. It was born out of survival. The collapse forced early Greeks to question everything, from the nature of gods to the very idea of fate. The realization that no one had control over the future made chaos seem like the only certainty. In the face of this chaos, Greek philosophers like Heraclitus would argue that everything is in flux, but one thing remained constant: human suffering. The very act of questioning became the first step in turning back from oblivion. In the wake of the collapse, the philosophical revolution in Greece was influenced by the unheard voices of Egyptians, Levantines, and other cultures. The earliest Greek philosophers, like Thales, were influenced by Egyptian astronomical knowledge and Babylonian mathematical systems, concepts of order emerging from the chaos of the collapse. But the philosophical revolution didn't just ask why, it asked, how can we change this? And in this search for change, they didn't just challenge gods, they started to question human nature itself. What if we could reshape our own fate? Early historians' shocking revelation. The written word wasn't just about recording history, it was about rewriting it. The Greeks in particular weren't just copying ancient texts, they were reinterpreting them, transforming the past into a new mythos. The Iliad and Odyssey, far from being mere stories, were a reflection of their own fractured world, retold as a way to make sense of the collapse. Greek philosophers didn't just start with questions, they started with the fear of forgetting. In a world where the gods had failed, they sought the eternal in human experience, preserving their memories in epic tales. History wasn't about chronicling events, it was about creating meaning, an act of defiance against the idea that everything is destined to fall apart. But what if this act of preservation was not the final word? What if the real revolution had yet to come? And what if the seeds of a far darker future were already planted in these reflections? Rebirth and reflection. Imagine a world where everything you know collapses, the gods fall silent, cities burn to the ground, and a once great civilization is left in ruins. But that's not the end. In the ashes, something darker and more monstrous begins to take shape. A hidden truth lurks in the shadows. It wasn't just the world that collapsed, it was the minds of men. Most people think the Bronze Age collapse was a simple chain of natural disasters and invasions. What they don't know is that what came after the collapse wasn't just rebuilding, it was the birth of a completely new type of power. The so-called Dark Ages weren't just a period of cultural stagnation. They were a black hole of transformation. The collapse didn't just scatter people, it forced them into an extreme survival mode that gave birth to the most brutal form of governance the world had ever seen. The Phoenicians, once quiet traders, now became the world's first pirate states, taking control of the seas and preying on those still too weak to defend themselves. The Egyptians, too, were forced to reconsider their divine kingship and adopted an even darker form of religious control under the 21st dynasty. But was this rebirth a sign of humanity's resilience? Or did something darker emerge in the wake of this collapse? Was the Iron Age the rise of civilization? Or was it the birth of warfare as we know it? We always talk about human resilience, but what if the resilience that followed the collapse didn't just heal societies? It hardened them into something far more ruthless. Post-collapse, societies like the Greeks began rewriting their identities, and in the ruins, they found something far more savage than their Bronze Age ancestors ever had: the will to conquer. With the rise of the hoplite warrior class, every man became a soldier, and battles were no longer about defending the homeland. They were about expanding it. Iron weapons made each man more dangerous than ever before. But here's the real shock. The Greeks weren't the first to use iron in warfare. It was the Philistines, invaders from the west, who first introduced iron weaponry to the Levant, and they were the ones who redefined what it meant to conquer. The rise of iron wasn't about advancing civilizations. It was about creating faster, bloodier, more efficient killing machines. So what happened when iron went mainstream? Did it save societies, or did it turn them into something far more monstrous? And why did the Greeks, and later the Romans, adopt these brutal new tools so willingly? The answer lies in a secret that no one talks about. Everything we know about civilization's rebirth is a lie. What we call resilience wasn't about restoring what was lost. It was about destroying the past and creating a new, more merciless world. The Phoenicians didn't just rebuild, they rewrote the rules of survival. They became the first global traders and pirates, not out of necessity, but out of sheer ruthlessness. And the Greeks? They weren't just philosophers and artists. They were the very architects of modern warfare. What historians won't tell you is that the collapse left a power vacuum, and what emerged wasn't just trade and philosophy. It was the militarization of every aspect of life. With the loss of old gods came the rise of new gods, gods of war and vengeance. This shift wasn't just philosophical, it was biological. Survival of the fittest, where might became right. But what if these new gods, these new systems of power, didn't just arise from chaos? They were imposed on people by those who survived the chaos? What if the collapse didn't just spark a rebirth, but a calculated war for control that shaped the course of history for centuries to come? Philosophers like Plato and Heraclitus weren't just discussing lofty concepts like fate and existence. They were responding to the cataclysmic shifts their world had undergone. The collapse left them questioning everything: the gods, the state, and most importantly, the very nature of power. For the first time in history, philosophy wasn't just a pursuit of knowledge. It was a quest to understand the darkness inside humanity. What if the darkness they sought to understand was not just in the gods, but in themselves? What if the collapse of their world taught them that human nature is the greatest catastrophe of all? The collapse wasn't just the end, it was a transformation. It wasn't rebirth, it was remaking. The very power structures we inherit today, the nations, the armies, the markets, are built on the rubble of this collapse. The survival of the fittest that we glorify today is rooted in this tragedy. The collapse didn't just give rise to civilization, it gave rise to the idea of conquest, the need to destroy what was to make something new. And that's what we're still doing today. What they don't tell you is that we are still trapped in the cycle of collapse and rebirth. We've just forgotten how brutal the price of rebuilding truly is. So the next time you hear someone say, resilience is what defines us, ask yourself this: what are we willing to sacrifice to rebuild? And is it worth it? What if the true lesson of the Bronze Age collapse isn't just about human resilience, but about the price of survival? What if the very idea of civilization as we know it was built on the suffering of others? The answer will change everything you thought you knew about humanity. In 1200 BCE, something happened that changed the course of history forever. Civilizations vanished, cities crumbled. The Bronze Age fell apart in a matter of decades. But this wasn't a simple collapse. It was a reset, a brutal, catastrophic reordering of the world that no one could have predicted. The old world didn't just fade, it was violently torn apart. And what emerged from its ashes wasn't rebirth, it was something much darker. The so-called Bronze Age collapse is still a mystery. Earthquakes, famines, invasions, the standard explanation. But here's what most don't tell you. What if a series of unknown forces, hidden forces, struck all at once, causing the destruction? Not just nature, but human recklessness. From the sudden rise of the sea peoples to climate shifts that triggered widespread famine, these weren't just external factors. They were internal, human choices. And this wasn't the first collapse. The end of the Bronze Age was merely the final act in a long string of miscalculations that began centuries earlier. Ever wonder why the Mycenaeans suddenly disappeared? It wasn't just warfare. Evidence suggests they were poisoned from within, their society betrayed by a generation of rulers more concerned with luxury than survival. The collapse was no accident, it was self-inflicted. The question is, were they the first to fall, or did others already know what was coming? What happened next wasn't about survival, it was about building new forms of power, ruthless in their efficiency. But who took the reins after the collapse? What we find in the aftermath is far more terrifying than we could imagine. New kingdoms rose from the ruins, but not the kind you expect. The Greeks, now fragmented, gave birth to a new militarized society, no longer ruled by gods, but by hoplites, men who fought for power, not belief. Meanwhile, the Phoenicians, the survivors of chaos, took to the seas, pirates, traders, conquerors, rewriting history with every ship they sent out. So what you don't know, the Phoenicians weren't just survivors, they were the first imperialists. They created the world's first global empire of trade and influence, not through armies, but by controlling the flow of knowledge. They didn't just conquer, they conquered minds. And the Greeks? Their empire wasn't based on enlightenment, it was based on military power. The rise of hoplite warfare was their brutal response to a world where the strong were the last to survive. How did the collapse turn these people into bloodthirsty empires? How did the lessons of the collapse transform them into rulers who viewed survival as the only measure of success? The world after the collapse wasn't a world of peace, it was a world where the price of survival was blood. New gods weren't about peace or justice, they were about sacrifice and dominance. And the societies that rose from the ashes didn't just rebuild, they created a new world order, one where power was stolen, not earned. Think the Greeks were philosophers? Think again. They didn't just talk about philosophy, they used philosophy to rationalize war. What we know as the Golden Age of Greece, it was a civilization built on the back of constant military campaigns and merciless domination. Might became their new moral code, and their philosophy was just a weapon used to justify bloodshed. While the Greeks may have been rethinking gods, they were simultaneously creating a world where the human spirit was tested in war. And that brings us to the ultimate question. Did these new empires truly escape the chaos of the collapse, or did they merely recreate it in a different form? From the ashes of the old world, a new empire was born, one of domination, survival, and unrelenting ambition. The Greeks, the Phoenicians, the Philistines, all gave rise to the concept of empire, a concept that would never die. This isn't just ancient history. The shadows of this collapse still haunt us, shaping the empires of today. From Rome to America, the world still operates on the same principles established by these survivors. Perhaps the collapse wasn't just the end of an age, it was the birth of a new era of power. And we are living in the legacy of those who learned the wrong lessons from the collapse, still guided by the ancient belief that survival at any cost is worth the price. The question is, how long will it take before we too collapse under the weight of our own ambition? Next, we explore how the rise of the Roman Empire, built on the foundations of the collapse, set the stage for the modern world's power struggles, and how the same cycles of rise, fall, and rebirth still control us. What if I told you that the greatest collapse in ancient history wasn't an accident, but the result of a perfect storm of hubris, climate change, and greed? The end of the Bronze Age wasn't just the fall of cities, it was the death of an entire worldview, and we're still paying the price today. In 1200 BCE, the world's most powerful civilizations, the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, and the Egyptians, were reduced to ruins. But we've only ever heard half the story. We've been told it was invasions, earthquakes, and uprisings. But no one has ever asked, was this a coordinated effort to bring down the old world? What if the collapse wasn't just a random series of events, but a strategic dismantling of an entire global system? From the mysterious sea peoples to droughts, what if nature itself was weaponized against these empires? These aren't just footnotes. They are the key to understanding what happened and what could happen again. But who were the sea peoples? The history books say they were invaders from the seas, but they left behind no trace, no origin, no records. What if they weren't just a ragtag group of marauders, but a military machine engineered to destroy the existing power structures? Could they have been the result of an ancient plot? A collaboration between rogue elements within the empires themselves, working in the shadows to bring everything down? As the great cities fell, the world didn't just lose its infrastructure, it lost its identity. The Bronze Age civilizations had been built on a single idea: globalization. Traders connected the farthest corners of the earth, empires forged in silver and iron ruled the day, and gods were worshipped as symbols of eternal power. But as the fires of war raged, something darker happened. Entire religions collapsed, taking their followers with them. And that's when the true cost of the collapse becomes evident. The survivors, scattered across the Mediterranean, were forced to confront not just external enemies, but the very gods they had once worshipped. What most people don't realize is that these cultures, the Greeks, Egyptians, Israelites, didn't just survive, they evolved. The gods they had worshipped before the collapse were recast into new myths. The Greeks, for example, would emerge from this apocalyptic landscape with their gods now questioning fate and free will. Why? Because their very faith had failed them in the face of catastrophe. But what was the true cost of their survival? How did this collapse shape the future in ways we've yet to fully understand? In the wake of the collapse, civilizations didn't just bounce back. They had to reinvent themselves. The Israelites, with their monotheistic God, weren't just another religion. They were the survivors of an ancient trauma, crafting a God who was as unforgiving as the collapse itself. The Greeks would worship gods who were not omnipotent, but fickle, vengeful, and easily swayed, echoing the fragility of the world they had inherited. And in the Phoenician city-states, trade would flourish again, but at a terrible cost. Were the Phoenicians truly the founders of modern capitalism? Or were they simply slaves to a system that had already collapsed once before? What's left out of history books is the fact that the Phoenicians didn't just trade, they were mercenaries. Their ships weren't just carriers of goods, they were carriers of power, paid to help create the next set of rulers. They were the real architects of empire, selling their loyalty to the highest bidder, reshaping the Mediterranean into a theater of endless war. But what if these survivors, struggling to rebuild, were actually paving the way for the greatest disaster of them all? The Bronze Age collapse left behind more than just ruins. It left behind a legacy of uncertainty. The surviving societies were forever changed, and their story is our story. We look to them as the beginning of modern civilization. But what if we're making the same mistakes? What if our world is more like the Bronze Age than we care to admit? Consider this. Just as the ancient world was built on the illusion of stability, we live in a world now dominated by the illusion of control. We too are at the mercy of forces beyond our control: climate change, economic instability, and global conflict. And just like those ancient civilizations, our world is already starting to crack. Will we rise from the ashes like they did, or are we already too late? Our fate may already be sealed, but to find out, we need to look deeper, back to the origins of our world and the catastrophic mistakes we've never learned from. If you're fascinated by the hidden forces that shaped our world, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Like, comment, and subscribe to join the journey through history's greatest secrets. Turn on notifications so you never miss a twist in the tale. Because the past is not just a story, it's a warning. Will you be ready for what comes next?